just seen Octavian become the first emperor of Rome, Caesar Augustus. And so we might want to ask, well, where did all of this, as we look back, how did Rome witness this slide into having this dictator? And I think we go back to Caesar. We see some of the things here. So let's go ahead and write this in your notes for today, that Caesar crosses the Rubicon, and instead of being scorned, instead of having people say, what are you doing? You're breaking the law and you're acting like a dictator. They greeted him instead, and he broke the law. Well, what happened there? Well, previous to Caesar becoming so powerful, there was a man by the name of Sulla. And Sulla actually takes Rome. He marches into Rome and takes Rome over with 6 legions. So imagine that. He had about 30,000 men. He was hired by the Senate. He did several things that changed changed the Roman character. Now, I think essentially the Romans had already changed. I think the Romans were corrupt. They were used to having slaves do all their work. They were lazy. They were looking to the government for things. And now they're getting land. So they were given land. There was a land reform, and the poor people were given more land. There was, as a result of Sulla's time as this dictator, and that's what he becomes. He's a dictator. He's only a dictator for a short time, for a 3-year period. This would be maybe an interesting thing to learn from. When something like the Senate places you dictator for 3 years, well, you have a limited time, and you have certain points that you're really working toward, and then they want you to step down. Well, land and unity. They also had an unemployment problem. They had lots of people who were unemployed. There was a real big need for jobs. Do you guys remember the name of the lower class of people? Not the patricians. They were the upper. Okay, yes, some of you got it. Plebs, which is short for plebeians. Remember that? They were one of the 2 major classes of Rome, the plebeians and the patricians. So what happens now is that because the Senate has acted here and they've invited Sulla to have total control, one thing that's interesting is that the army is no longer loyal to Rome. They are no longer loyal to Rome. They're now loyal to a person. They're loyal to a general. And so the first time this happens is with Sulla. Sulla is the first general who basically has his men loyal to him. Okay? Now, I know some of us were amazed when you found, for instance, in World War II, that Hitler, the dictator of Germany, had men and women swear to him that they were under his control. They didn't take an oath of allegiance to Germany. They took an oath of allegiance to Hitler. Can you believe that? Well, guess what? Sulla did it first. Sulla actually did this. It's hard to imagine. It would be like saying, okay, the state is going to just be everything, and we're no longer, we're just after dictators, supporting dictators. But that's what they did. So Caesar was maybe the second person, Julius Caesar, to do this. And as you guys know, the 10th and the 12th legions were the troops that were very loyal to him, and these were the legions that he brought across the Rubicon. These were the legions that fought with him in Gaul. They saw him, that he was a great commander. They liked him. They saw him as governor. He was governor of Gaul. And you remember, for 10 years. And he conquers Gaul. And remember, we listed all those areas that Caesar had conquered. What today is France, Belgium, Holland, Switzerland, and parts of Germany. And he also conquered into England. So he writes this Conquest of Gaul, this famous book, in the third person. And he really does this to promote himself. So this Conquest of Gaul is his book, and he's trying to put himself in front of the people. Okay? Caesar ends up being dictator for 5 years. And he's finally assassinated by Brutus and Cassius, the other conspirators. Oh, by the way, you probably know this, but I'm going to say it anyway. You know, people wonder, well, was his assassination that bloody? Yes, it really was. There were 19 times that he was stabbed by the conspirators. And then there's one flyer I gave you today that has a picture of the altar where he was stabbed. So there's actually the spot in Rome where Caesar had been stabbed. And so some of you, if you ever go to Italy and you see these sites in Rome, that would be probably a great spot to go visit, kind of imagine all that stabbing that took place. And of course that happened in 44 BC, and that's when the second triumvirate took over. Who were they? They were, actually there was a civil war that took over, but then the second triumvirate won over the conspirators, and they took over. Lepidus, Octavian, and Antony. So can we learn from history? Yes, I think we learn from history. I think there's things that are very valuable that we learn from history. I'm going to kind of put down some of the positive and some of the negative points. I'm going to put plus and put minus. So what are some of these positive and negative points about Rome? Well, I think very strong army. This was one of their positive points. Now, of course, that can be used as a negative. If you have a dictator, he can use that for evil. A very good sized, pretty efficient bureaucracy. So the bureaucracy handled most of the things in Rome and worked with the local governments. A very big plus, I think, is their road system. We're going to be looking at Roman roads. I've got an article that I'm going to give you later, but wow, these roads are still operational. A lot of them are still existing, still handle trade, and so the very good roads are going to really benefit trade, defense. They're, a traveler. Travelers are going to be well protected. It allows for a lot of flexibility. People can move around, can go relocate. There's flexibility. There's innovation that can happen with good roads and lots of trade. The economy is going to prosper. Well, let's look at some negatives. Well, one big, huge negative is the gruesome entertainment, the gladiator games, right? So if you can imagine you know, all these people in the stadium like watching a football game, but the people are not just playing a game down there, they're killing each other. That's what a gladiator game really was all about. So very gruesome entertainment. Okay. Also, there was, I think a negative was how unified, there was a unity of government. It all got stuck under one person. Okay, so it was very easy to have a takeover. There were no separation of powers, see. There was no difficulty. A person could seize control pretty easily and move ahead with their agenda. A person could take over. They could take control of the army. And so this was, I think, a negative thing. I think another negative thing is that the soldiers, we've mentioned this already, the soldiers became loyal to a person. They were loyal to a general. Okay, as we resume our list from the previous items that we listed, we can see maybe a positive for Rome is it adopted and modified techniques from different countries, different techniques, different ideas. For instance, they took the toga from the Etruscans. They took the chariots also from the Etruscans. They took ideas that from their conquered neighbors and they applied them. So you can see that the Romans, very ambitious. I think I would not want to be a neighbor to the Romans, okay? You never know when they're going to attack. Probably one of the greatest things that you see emerge in Rome is their engineering ability. They're builders and engineers. They're very able to adjust to different situations. They're very much and they were able to shift boundaries, okay? Another really good one, I think a really good, is that early on they did have a Roman Republic. Not all the power was in the hands of one man. So there were rights that were given to the common people. Common people were protected. And if you remember, they had 2 tribunes in the government, and the tribunes could stand up at any time. They were representative of the people, and they had the veto power. They would stand up and say veto, which means I forbid. So there was this protection of the common people. Well, let's go back over to the negative side. We mentioned that the Caesar's 10th and 12th legions were very loyal to him, okay? And in fact, the legions, I think a negative thing is that you look at some of their signage and the signifers or the standards had spork. What is spork? Okay, what does that mean? Well, it means, it's an abbreviation that means Senate, Populi, K, Romi, which means the Senate and the people of Rome. So the standard said very clearly that the legion was under the power of the Senate. It's supposed to be under the Senate and the people. But in actuality, that was ignored, and now, under the current time there, now that we have an emperor, it's now under the general. So the armies became loyal to the general, and that was really a critical thing. For instance, if Caesar could not have marched south of the Rubicon, he would not have seized control with the army. Even if people had greeted him personally, he didn't have. See, the army gave him the power. The army gave him the power to take over. And so one of the things that we have in our government, another, I think, real good thing, is that the army, the armed services, is not under the control of generals. It's under civilian control. So at the head of our Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, Merchant Marines, Coast Guard, the whole thing is under the president. The president is popularly elected. Now, the president might be a general, like General Eisenhower became president, General Jackson became president, General Washington was president. We've had a number of generals that became president, but the idea is the office is under the control of the people. Now, another huge thing that was a very, very bad thing was the slavery that we saw in Rome. Huge problem. And this eventually, besides being so brutal on the people that were slaves, it also causes unemployment, because the people cannot be employed when you have slaves. Why employ people and pay them an income if you've got slaves? And so at one point, slavery in the Roman Empire was more than 50 million. Now, to give you a little contrast, in the United States, and we know slavery was bad in the United States, we had 3.5 million slaves in the U.S. Isn't that interesting? So they had well over 10 times the slaves. I'm going to say close to 15 times the slaves, about 14 times the slaves in the Roman Empire, okay? And so one of the things that we see happen is in Rome, we see some slave rebellions. And an example was Spartacus, okay? A slave revolt. And Spartacus led about 50,000 slaves in a rebellion. And they took off, they got free, and formed their own army, and ran around destroying things. Okay? So, also one of the things that you see as a problem is that the empire became too large. The empire was too extensive. It became too large. And so you couldn't really control it. It was too big. And with that, many people hated, the Romans were hated by the people that they conquered. And a good example was the Jews. The Israelites hated the Romans. They oppressed the Jews. Now, on the positive side, you see some interesting things with the tribune that who can say, I forbid, I veto this law that the Senate has passed. You also see an assembly that is in the Roman government, and the assembly is able to advise the Senate. So the assembly really represented the common people, okay, and they advise the Senate, which is good, that the Senate can get advice. Now, lastly, I think a positive is that you see some pretty positive emperors. And I'm going to get 3 of these up here real quick. I think Constantine was one of the more positive emperors. Constantine, for instance, passed a law halting persecution of Christians. And he also halted the gladiator games. So here's a person, he's a reformer, and for that reason a lot of people think that he really was a Christian. He claimed to be a Christian, but a lot of people say, well, I think he was the real deal. Vespasian was another very good emperor, and Marcus Aurelius. Marcus Aurelius. Very, very good emperor. Okay, so had good ideas, had good reforms. One emperor that was, I think, very beneficial as well was the Emperor Justinian. And we'll be talking about many of these emperors as we continue our study. Now, we have this situation now with the empire that is becoming very strong, very widespread. And the empire, I'm going to put an E for the empire, stretches from Scotland up in northern Europe all the way to the Sahara Desert in Africa. Okay, so think about this. Now, all this empire, and they didn't have a phone service, they didn't have computers, all this area, all of this took place on 3 continents. See, even the United States is not on 3 continents. We're in North America, and we got a long ways out to Hawaii, but we're not on 3 continents. So talk about a spread out situation. More than 50 million people were residents in this empire, and it was the greatest political prize, the greatest prize ever seen. No wonder ambitious men like Julius Caesar wanted to be an emperor, because it was such a prize. It was such an opportunity. So we'll pause and we'll go to the 4th video coming up.